And welcome, AP Econ students. We are going to look at an old AP exam. This question is from the AP Macro exam from 2015. And we're going to look at all three parts to it, but we'll start off here with number one. So, the question says, assume that the United States economy is operating below full employment. So, if you can read this well enough here, that's great. Otherwise, head to the AP Central website and go to AP Macro in the year 2015 to get a better copy if you need one. We're going to refer to this one here. So it says, assume that the United States economy is operating below full employment. Now, the first thing you need to know is that in macro, in general, there's three scenarios. And so I'm going to periodically put some notes here to the side, and then we'll bounce back and forth to the question. But in general, what they're going to do is give you a situation, one of these three scenarios. Either the economy is in long-run equilibrium and everything's good, the macro asterisk. The economy is in a recession, so we're on the cold side. Or the economy is in an inflationary gap, we're in the hot side. Okay, one of these three things is going to happen, except that there's multiple ways to say this. So let's just address the middle one. If they say everything's in long-run equilibrium, they may say that. They may say the economy is operating at full employment. They'll make an employment comment. Or it's possible they'll make a comment about the Phillips curve. So they could say the Phillips curve is in long-run equilibrium and everything's fine. But they may make a comment about the employment. If the economy is occurring higher than normal unemployment, you just go, well, if a lot of people are unemployed, then we have a cold economy, it's this one. The economy is currently functioning at an unemployment level that is lower than the natural rate of unemployment. Well, when you hear lower than the natural rate, that must be a really hot economy. So maybe we have this situation. So depending on how they're going to say it, it's one of these three things. And they're just going to see if they can fool you or see if you know your stuff about which way it is. So the initial question says, assume that the U.S. economy is operating below full employment. Well, below full employment means things are bad, we're in a recession, and this is what you have. So with that said, now it says, draw a correctly labeled graph of the long-run aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and show each of the following. So basically, we'll draw a nicer version of this, and if you have a straight edge, you can use that, or if you feel pretty good about drawing freehand, I'm going to put this up here. And I'm going to put my long-run curve here. I'm going to label this axis quantity of real GDP. I'm going to call this my price level. PL is fine. And we're currently experiencing unemployment, which means my equilibrium must be to the left on the cold side here. Here is my aggregate demand. Here is my short-run aggregate supply. And this is my long-run aggregate supply. Now, we have all sorts of extra little things we can put on here that help us understand, like the cold side, hot side, FE for full employment, POT for potential, GDP. But for the ADAS model, this is what they're looking for. And now what it says is, label the current equilibrium output as Y sub 1. Well, this is currently where we are. And in economics, the horizontal axis here is actually Y. And that comes from the circular flow. I'm not going to draw the whole thing, but if you remember the circular flow in macro, when you leave your households here, if you recall, we have the government, we have taxation here, and there's government spending, there's consumption, there's saving to a financial market that turns into business spending, and this is the POG right here, and then we have the relationship with the rest of the world. So we had C, I, G, and NX. And if you recall, these four pipes, they flow into the businesses and firms, but eventually when it turns into income, we just call this Y. So this is actually, remember, all the money that's flowing through here is the real GDP. So it's also the Y pipe here, so that's why this axis is called Y. So that's not a mistake whenever you see that. So that's Y sub 1. And they want you to label the price level at that spot also as PL sub 1. So get used to, make sure you write nice and neat and take your time here. So we have price level sub 1. and full employment labeled as Y sub F. So we know that this is full employment here, so we are Y sub F. Okay? So this was question A, parts 1 and 2. Okay? Now, what's going to happen is, regardless of the situation they give you, you're going to have to fix it. And if it's in long-run equilibrium and things are good, they're going to give you a catalyst. But in this situation, clearly we have a problem, and we're going to have to fix the problem. So I'm going to move back over here for part B. Okay? And the problem says, assume that the Federal Reserve targets a new federal funds rate to reach full employment. What should the Federal Reserve target, a higher or lower federal funds rate? Well, just a quick review, and as I go through these, I'm going to be writing some notes about the topic, and then we'll erase them, but just to kind of refresh your memory of things we've gone over. If you remember, when you solve things with monetary policy, there's 3 tools in the monetary policy tool basket. And if you recall, it is the reserve ratio, which was RR, it was the discount rate, and it was the open market operations, and we had this chart. And this would be the condition of the economy, and do you have a hot economy or do you have a cold economy? It depends what you would do. So this will be a good little review here. When you have a cold economy and you need to heat it up like this one would be, we would lower the reserve ratio, we would lower the discount rate, and we would buy bonds. All 3 of these have the same effect in the money market. If we had a hot economy, we would do just the opposite. We would raise or increase the reserve ratio, we would raise or increase the discount rate, and we would sell bonds. Now, I want to focus on this one. All 3 of these right here are going to have this effect in the money market. And this, again, is part of the review as we go through. You want to have the money market understood, that we have the supply of money controlled by the Fed, the demand of money, and this is going to be the quantity of money, and this is going to be nominal, not real, nominal interest rates. And so you know that in order to get an economy going, low interest rates are very stimulative, and low interest rates make people borrow money. So if right now this is our interest rates and we want them lower, the Fed just increases the money supply to get these rates down lower, which triggers borrowing and spices up the economy. Well, the part that was a little bit weird about this question is it says the Federal Reserve targets the federal funds rate. And this is one of those deals where your instincts totally go against you, because something that's called the federal funds rate sure sounds like the Fed's in charge of it, but actually the federal funds rate is the rate that banks charge each other. The discount rate is the rate that the Fed charges other banks. So logic would tell you, why didn't they call this one the federal funds rate and this one called the discount rate? It's just not the way it is. So even though this is not one of these 3 tools, this will follow the pattern that's established by the change in the money supply. So when any of these 3 things are done, the federal funds rate follows in suit. So even though if you want to lower a federal funds rate, you're going to do any of these things with rates, and this will follow. So they were kind of throwing a little bit of a curveball. Are you going to get flustered by thinking, well, wait, this isn't one of those 3, or are you going to realize that this follows anyway? So that was the whole point. So it says, assume the Federal Reserve targets a new federal funds rate that we need it to be lower to spice up this economy. Should the Federal Reserve target a higher or a lower federal funds rate? Well, just like the discount rate, we want to target to be lower. And so and you don't have to explain anything. All they want you to do is state that it would be lower. So we're going to target a lower one. Then part C says, given the Federal Reserve action you identified in B, which we just did, draw a correctly labeled graph of the money market and show the effect on the nominal interest rate. Well, as it turns out, as I go through these and I draw some notes trying to explain this, I might accidentally, or inadvertently anyway, actually answer a question that's coming up, which I just did right here. But I'm going to draw it again over here. This is part C, and it says draw the correctly labeled money market. So you want to take your time here. And I'm actually going to label this the money market. And I'm going to just redraw what I just did. Because it says draw a correctly labeled graph of the money market and show the effect on the nominal interest rate. Well, we'll just go ahead and draw our demand for money. We will draw our supply curve for the money market. Here is our quantity of money. And our vertical axis is nominal interest rates. Now, just to remind you, real interest rates is the loanable funds market, but the money market is nominal. So what happened was we needed to increase the money supply in order to get those interest rates lower. So there's going to be my SM prime. So what it says here is, given the federal funds action determined in Part B, draw a correctly labeled graph of the money market and show the effect. So by getting that money supply bigger, what you want to show is the effect on interest rates. So there was my first interest rate. I could call it IR1, and now here's IR2, and I'm just showing that it lowered the interest rate. And whoever is grading this is going to be an econ person, so make sure that you realize you don't have to explain as if someone's never done this before. You're explaining it to someone that understands the lingo and the jargon, and they're waiting to see if you explain your or you give the appropriate explanations in that context, so you don't have to be overly wordy with anything. But this is just drawing the graph anyway, and there's no explanation yet. Okay, now Part D. Part D says the policymakers now pursue a fiscal policy rather than monetary policy. So this is not unusual. In a question, when they give you a problem in the economy, you can anticipate they're going to have you solve it with a fiscal approach and then also solve it with a monetary approach. On this one, they gave us the monetary approach first, and now we'll switch over here and we're going to approach with fiscal policy. So I'm going to get these out of the way. And so I'm usually going to take up the whole board here and as I keep going. So here was A, B, C, here's D. So we pursue fiscal policy. Assume that the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8 and this gap here is 300 billion. So I'm putting this on my board. You wouldn't necessarily put this on your actual diagram, but we did this before. So we have a $300 billion gap that needs to be saved, or needs to be fixed. And we're going to do it with now fiscal policy. So what we want is the aggregate demand curve to move to the right and close the gap. That's our goal. And we know we have, with fiscal policy, we can change consumption, or we could change government spending. So, they tell us right here, I'm just going to write this down, they tell us that our marginal propensity to consume is equal to 0.8. Well, what's assumed that you guys know then is that your marginal propensity to save is equal to 0.2, and then on top of that, your spending multiplier is going to be 1 over 0.2, which is going to be 5. And that's going to be important. So, in order to fix the gap, we know that the gap, if we solve this with government spending anyway, so with the first one, it's government spending, the gap is equal to the government spending policy times the spending multiplier. And so you would say, well, okay, it's a $300 billion gap, and the government spending times the money multiplier, which is 5, divide both sides by 5, and we get $60 billion is equal to the government spending. And you just show your work. It's pretty straightforward. Okay, now all of these old exams we go over, there's no calculator question. There's no calculators allowed in the exam, though there is this year. So when you go back and look at these, they usually give you pretty friendly values. Okay, so this was part 1. Okay, and now in part 2 of the question, it says, what if the government decides to change taxes? So you guys know from fiscal policy, you can either affect taxation or government spending. So now they're going to approach it with taxes. Now, the question doesn't ask for a specific answer, it just asks for a general answer, but it's good review just to go over it anyway. So let's go ahead and solve this now with taxation. If we wanted to solve it with taxation, we would say, well, now the gap is equal to your marginal propensity to consume, the spending multiplier, times the tax cut. Or, if you prefer, some of you prefer this thing called the tax multiplier, which is just going to be the marginal propensity to consume divided by the marginal propensity to save times the tax cut. Whichever one of those you like, they're the same thing. So the gap again is $300 billion. My marginal propensity to consume is 0.8. My spending multiplier is, from here, is 5. And then I'm going to figure out what my tax cut would be. All right, so this is actually 0.8. I want to make sure that I have the decimal down here. That is 0.8 okay, times 5 times the tax cut. Well, 5 times 0.8 is going to be 0.4. So I'm going to do 0.4 times my tax cut right here. Okay, and sorry, 4 rather. And if you were to do it this way, I just want to show you, if you were to do the tax multiplier method, which is also out there, the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, marginal propensity to save is 0.2. If you did it this route, you would get 0.8 divided by 0.2, which is equal to 4 that way. It doesn't matter. You get 4 either way. Well, then we divide both sides by 4, and we get $300 billion divided by 4 is equal to the tax cut. And if we divide that through there, we wind up getting 75 billion. Now again, this question does not ask for that specificity, it asks a general question. So let's go back to the question. It says, if the government changes taxes without changing government spending to eliminate the recessionary gap, will the minimum required change in taxes be greater than, smaller than, or equal to the minimum change in government spending in Part D? Well, without doing this work, something you should know is, if you ever want to fix a recessionary gap with taxation changes, it's going to result in more of a change because the marginal propensity to consume eats away at the change. You don't spend all of your money on a simple level. Now, if you actually solved it, you could say, oh, well, there it is. 75 is bigger than 60. But the main point they're looking for is if it's greater than, less than, or equal, and you could say the tax cut, or we'll say tax change, is greater. And the reason it's greater, the thing that's messing up the whole equation, is the marginal propensity to consume. It's only 0.8. If it was 1, then it would be different. But that would have changed the savings rate, and so saying that the tax change is greater because marginal propensity to consume is equal to 0.8. And that's fine. That explains that you realize that is we're needing a bigger amount because we only get to take 0.8 of it to fix this gap. So that's an acceptable answer. Okay, now it's time for Part E. It says, assume the government lowers income tax rates to eliminate the gap. Will each of the following increase, decrease, or stay the same? Well, if the government lowers income tax, and so we could look at this one here, it's whichever one of these we did, the fiscal policy, if we look back over here, that's going to affect aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is going to increase and close the gap. So just for note purposes, I'm not going to label everything here, but this is our situation. Okay, and so these are going to lead to an increase in aggregate demand, and my aggregate demand would come over here and close the gap. So that's the whole point of this question. So the question says, what will happen to aggregate demand? Explain. And so I'm going to put E right here, and I would say aggregate demand increases. Okay, now it increases because, and asks us to explain, aggregate demand increases because a decrease in taxes leads to an increase in consumption, which leads to an increase in aggregate demand. And that would be fine. That shorthand is fine. Okay, and if you feel more comfortable, you can write a sentence and you can say, because literally, a decrease in taxes leads to an increase in consumption, which leads to an increase in aggregate demand. That would be fine. Okay. Now the next question says, what happens to the long-run aggregate supply? Now, for this situation here, because it was just consumption or government spending that increases it, the long-run curve here, our vertical one, there's no change. In fact, it's now happy that the aggregate demand is back where it belongs. And so we would say on Part 2 here, so that was Part 1. So on Part 2 here, what happens to the long-run aggregate supply? There is no change. No change, because aggregate demand returns to long-run equilibrium. Now, one thing you have to be careful of is that as you read the solutions, which I highly recommend you do, sometimes you'll see more than one answer. And there is another way to look at this that I don't want to confuse you with, but just don't be surprised if on the solutions you see that there is, you'll see a lot of ors. There's some questions that can have literally up to 4 or 5 answers depending on what you choose for the answer and the explanation. And sometimes that can be a little confusing, but it's because we're doing intro level economics, sometimes there's some intermediate or more advanced concepts that can get woven into these scenarios that can actually lead to multiple answers. And so instead of penalizing you for a more sophisticated answer, they go ahead and allow it, because it kind of depends on your teacher. In a normal year, it's not unusual that my students would be able to answer questions more than one way, because I try to bring in some more advanced things to consider, and you guys always have great questions and tend to consider things many other students would not. So just don't let that confuse you, and if it does, just disregard the extra answers and just focus in on the one that's the one I'm giving you here. So that is the first question that, without the explanation, this normally takes you about, I don't know, maybe 5 or 10 minutes to do, and that's the longer of the 3 questions. So next we will move on to question number 2. Okay, now moving on to question number 2. Question number 2 is a trade table question, and it just says, country X and country Y are trading partners and both produce furnaces and solar panels. The countries can produce the following amounts using equal amounts of resources. Well, let's just do a quick review of how trade tables work. Now, that was a first semester topic, and if you recall, whenever we had a trade table, we would have 2 countries or producers, and then we would have 2 items that they were making. And usually we'd have something like, USA and Brazil or something like that, but you'll find that the econ tests are not very creative at all. And so here's our countries, X and Y. Here's our product, furnaces and solar panels. Okay? And then, if you recall, you had to know, is this an input or an output question? So as we read the question, it says, country X and country Y are trading partners, both produce these items. And so it's not telling us the resources needed to make it, it's just telling them we produce it. So this is an output question, and that's going to be important regarding our ratios. So it says country X produces 6 furnaces, and you want to make that to the left, or they can produce 8 solar panels. And country Y can produce 6 furnaces, or 12. Okay? Now, whenever you get a trading partner or a trade table type question, what I like to do is just go ahead and set up the trade table, figure out everything, and then go to the questions. So what I'm going to do is let's go ahead and figure out our per unit costs. And so if you remember, because this is an output, we would do other goes over, because for output, remember the shortcut was output, other goes over. So what I want to figure out is what is the per unit for just for one item, one furnace or one solar panel. Okay, so as we go through this, I'm going to take the other and put it over the top here. So I'm going to go 8 over 6. So that's going to reduce to 4/3. So I would say one furnace is equal to 4/3. I'm just going to put an S for a solar panel. Okay, and then I'm going to do the reciprocal over here, and I would say, well, one solar panel would be 3/4 of a furnace. Okay, and then over here, I would say for country Y, other goes over, I would say, well, I get one furnace for 2 solar panels. And then for here, I would get one solar panel would be equal to 1/2 of a furnace. Okay? And now, if you remember, we had things about absolute advantage and comparative advantage. So absolute advantage was just who can make the most stuff. So if we look at furnaces, Both countries, if they apply all their resources, can make 6, so no one has an absolute advantage. But in solar panels, country Y can definitely make the most. So 12 is greater than 8, so they have an absolute advantage. Now, comparative advantage, remember, we did the example earlier in the year about cheating, and it was whoever gives up the least amount of time is going to be the person to do that homework. So which country gives up the least to make the item? Well, in order to make a furnace, country Y gives up 2 solar panels, whereas country X only gives up 4/3. These guys have a lower opportunity cost, so they should specialize in making furnaces. Now over here, country Y only gives up half a furnace, where these guys give up 3/4 of a furnace, and so we're going to have country Y specializing in that. Now, normally, whenever you take the time to do that, you've just answered all the questions. It just depends when they come up. So now let's come back over here and look at A, and let's see what they say. Which country has an absolute advantage in producing solar panels? We already talked about it. It was country Y. Now, if it doesn't say explain, you don't need to. So I'm just going to say country Y. Part B says, calculate the opportunity cost of a furnace in country Y. We already did that. Country Y, a furnace, 1 furnace. 1 furnace costs country Y 2 solar panels. Okay, moving on to part C. Which country has the comparative advantage in producing furnaces, and then explain? So who has the comparative advantage in making furnaces? We decided country X does. So we'll get a point for saying country X. Country X has the comparative advantage, and so we can go ahead and say has comparative advantage, and our explain, and we can say because. There's 2 ways you guys can say this. You could say because they have, and this is what I recommend, you can say because they have a lower opportunity cost. And then you can actually state what they are. You could say 4/3 is less than 2. Okay? But if you just state they have a lower opportunity cost, you'll probably be just fine. All right. Then we're on to part D. Okay. Part D says, if the terms of trade were that 2 furnaces are exchanged for 1 solar panel, should country X produce solar panels domestically or import? Okay, well, let's do a little timeout here, and let's come back, and because it's been a while since you've done this, I'm going to switch here to red. I want to go over something here. When it came to making a trade arrangement that was beneficial for both countries, what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on this one right here. Okay? So here is the deal. Here is what would make a good deal for both. Okay? A good deal for both would be 1 furnace for any number, okay? Any number of solar panels that was less than 2 but greater than 4/3. Okay? That would be a good deal for both countries. Now, as long as the trade, now let's look at country X. As long as you get more than 4/3 of a solar panel, that's a good deal. So you need the number country X needs. So I'm going to say X needs a number greater than 4/3. Y needs a number less than 2. Now, the full-blown explanation without doing this in person is a little bit tough to do. But if it's not, if you were to example, you came up to somebody and said, hey, let's trade. And they say, I'll give you 1 furnace for 1 solar panel. And you look at that and just say, well, this is worth 4/3 of a solar panel, and that's a bad deal. It's a bad deal for X, because they need it to be more than 4/3. That would still be a good deal for these guys, for country Y, because it cost them 2 solar panels to make a furnace. So they would gladly trade for 1. And again, if that following that can be a little tricky in this format, so you just want to have locked in. The key is you need a number that is in between the opportunity costs. Okay, so what is a good deal? I'm going to say here for both. When there's a good deal for both countries, it's in between here, which is why I wrote this right here. It'd be one furnace for any number that's in between those two. X needs a number bigger than 4/3. Y needs a number less than 2. All right. Now, if we were to do this over here, I'll actually switch to blue on this one, just for the practice of analyzing it. If we looked at this one, I'm going to put this one down here. I would say, all right, a good deal for both. A good deal for both would be one solar panel for, and let's see if you could figure that out, any number between, so we need to be less than 3/4, but greater than 1/2. Okay, and so I need a number that is, the furnace number anyway, I need that to be bigger than 1/2, but I need it to be less than 3/4. So if you give me that situation, that's a good deal. Okay, now X needs, for it to be a good deal for them, X needs a number less than 3/4. In this case, Y needs a number greater than 1/2. Okay, so it flip-flops as far as what they need, and the reason is the opportunity cost of what they're specializing in. So, let's see, and again, these are on old, there's a full explanation here on an old PowerPoint if you want to go back. I think it was Unit 3, 2 or 3, I can't recall. So now let's go back and see what they said. So question D proposes this. They say, if the terms of trade were that 2 furnaces are exchanged for 1 solar panel. So let's look at that. 2 furnaces for 1 solar panel. Okay. Well, there's 2 ways to look at this one. And by the way, then it focuses on country X. Should country X produce solar panels domestically or import them from country Y? So let's see what's going to happen here at the solar panel one. So 2 furnaces for 1 solar panel. I'm just going to flip-flop this, and I'm going to say, well, the way I have it written over here, that would be 1 solar panel for 2 furnaces. Okay? So I want you guys to say, this is what the question is saying, and you have to take this and compare it to what we've got. So I'm actually going to just bring this over here and say, let's apply this proposal to this situation. So if you look at it, 1 solar panel for 2 furnaces, you could say, well, they're asking what should country Y do, and you'd say, well, 1 solar panel for 2 furnaces, these guys need a number. If you notice down here, country X needs a number that's less than 3/4 in order to make this a good deal, and country Y needs a number bigger than 1/2 because they need a number between. So if you come down here, Y needs the number bigger than 1/2. X needs the number smaller than 1/4. So they gave you a number that's not in between. It is bigger than 1/2, so this would be a great deal for country Y. This is not bigger or not less than 3/4, so this is a bad deal for country X. Country X should just go ahead and make them themselves. Now there is another, and because they're asking about solar panels, you could flip this around and compare it with furnaces, but we're looking at solar panels. So the question says, should country X produce them domestically or import them? So the secret to success when they give you a proposal is you just see if it fits. So what most students don't have a problem with is they see the question and they say, oh, well, the number here is not in between, so it's not a good deal for both. But usually it is a good deal, or what they'll do is they'll give you a situation that's good for one of them but not both. So is it good for both? No, because 2 is not in between here. But it is good for one of them. And 2 is bigger than 1/2, so it's good for country Y, not good for country X. And the question says, should country X produce solar panels domestically or import them? Well, they should produce them domestically because this is a bad deal. And so your answer is produced domestically. And you don't have to explain why. We went through it, so it's just produced domestically. Okay. Now, if you have trouble following that, rewatch this again and go through there and figure out whenever you get a terms of trade. That's what this was. Terms of trade. The secret is it fits between, and when it doesn't, it's benefiting one, not the other. Okay. So the other. You could have flipped this around if you wanted and solved this, divided both by 2, and you could have done one furnace for half of a solar panel, and you could have looked at it this way. But because they were asking about what you should do with solar panels, I decided to leave it the way it was and compare it over here. Okay, so that's just question 2. And again, as I go through these, I'm going to be going through a little bit of notes and reviewing some things, and so if that... but if it wasn't for that, you can move through this one probably in about 5 minutes. Okay. Now, question number 3 for the year 2015. Question number 3 has to do with exchange rates, which is not going to be something you're responsible for the 2020 exam, so we don't need to worry about this. So for 2015 macro review, all you have to worry about is knowing how to do question 1 and question 2. So there it is, AP Macro 2015. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.